Welcome everyone to our fourth workshop in this series, Working Well with Women with Disabilities. Today we'll be talking about resources and support. This workshop series was developed by WILD in partnership with WorkUp Queensland and Queenslanders with Disability Network. Women with disability were involved in all aspects of development, facilitation of live workshops, and recording these videos. We use the term women with disability in this series, and I want to acknowledge that this is inclusive of all women with all disabilities in every identity, and that also includes chronic health conditions. We wish to thank the women involved for sharing their experiences and their wisdom, and this particular workshop was originally co-delivered and co-designed by myself, Siobhan Gibbs, and Erica. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge that we work and live on stolen land. We wish to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And particularly, we want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've contributed to this project, as well as their ongoing wisdom sharing and support for our sectors. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. We wish to also acknowledge all the people with disability that have contributed to this project and continue to support our sectors. Their wisdom is invaluable, and they are paving the way for more inclusive and accessible communities and services. So before we jump in, just taking a moment to remind us all to take care of ourselves throughout working through this training series. The subject matter throughout this series and in today's workshop will discuss gendered violence, abuse, and neglect. This may be a triggering or difficult topic for some, so please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. At any point, feel free to pause the video and come back to it later. It's also okay to feel challenged. Particularly today, we'll be looking at resources and support for workers and for clients with disabilities and how we can work better together. If you do need additional support, 1-800-RESPECT is a great counselling service that you can seek some support from. So like I mentioned at the beginning of our workshop, this is the fourth in our series. If you haven't watched the previous workshops, I really encourage you to go back and watch these before continuing on, as this is a continuation. I also want to particularly note that this workshop series was developed for workers in Queensland that work in domestic and family violence, sexual violence, and women's health and wellbeing. There will be some resources and specific services that we discuss and recommend today that are only based in Queensland or only accessible to Queensland residents. So if you do work and live interstate, I do encourage you to have a look at our handout where there's a few links to different places where you'll be able to find your local support services. So today's workshop will cover resources and support for women with disabilities from external support and internal support. So looking at, as workers, externally, when we can look outwards for external referral pathways, accessing advocacy support for the people we're working with, innovative external supports, and facilitating warm referrals and handover when you're supporting someone to access another service. And then we'll also be looking at internal support, so what we can do within our own practice context to work better with women with disabilities. So that includes skill development and reflective practice, resources, creating interagency support teams, and creating client-directed support plans. All of the information we discussed today will be contained in your handout, as well as some additional resources and additional training links. So I really encourage you to utilize the handout to see where you can get some extra support for people you might be working with. So it's really important when we are working with people with disabilities that we acknowledge the importance of shared knowledge. People with Disabilities Australia were funded by the Queensland Government to generate a review of the impacts of domestic and family violence on people with disability. As we can see here from the quote from that report, it appears unlikely that any single organisation has all the services and expertise that the diversity of people with disability require during or after experiences of violence and abuse. So acknowledging from the outset that none of us, not even specialised organisations such as WILD, where I work, actually have access to all of the resources and necessary skills and understanding to work best with people with disabilities, particularly when they're experiencing sexual violence or domestic and family violence. And so really thinking about how we can utilize the broader supports across services and across our sector so that we can work best with people with disabilities. A really great contribution when developing this workshop series was working with some women with chronic health conditions, including Erica, that we'll hear from later in the workshop, about those experiences of living with a chronic health condition and how that impacts their chances of accessing services and support. So often people with chronic health conditions are forgotten or excluded when discussing disability. Across 50 plus disabilities, fatigue was the most debilitating but disbelieved symptom. So you can see here on the chart that you can see the purple bar there is fatigue of some of the symptoms that people with different disabilities and chronic health conditions experience. So really remembering when we talked about good practice in the previous workshop, offering a way of working together that works best for them. Remembering always to offer breaks within a session and working across multiple sessions where possible. It's also important to always come back to our unconscious bias, which is when we might be making assumptions about a person or feeling potentially frustration towards someone because of their identity based on a bias we developed by someone else we worked with previously, or a myth or assumption we've begun to make throughout our practice. So always being really aware of how that can impact when you're working with someone, and always finding opportunities to reflect with other workers to see if you are the best fit for working with a certain client. To get started, we're going to begin with a case study. So this is for Tara, and I'll read it now, and then I will ask you to pause the video, have a reflection on the questions and maybe discussion with your colleagues, and then come back to the video. So you've received a self-referral on the phone. You are a worker at a sexual violence service. The woman Tara on the phone says that she's been assaulted by her housemate in the house she lives in. Tara says she spoke to the disability support worker at the house 2 days ago immediately after the assault, and they said not to tell anyone until the worker spoke to their boss. Tara says she feels sick in the stomach and is worried she might get into trouble with the support workers by talking to you. So as a worker, what are your initial concerns and what do you suggest as the first steps working with Tara? So pause the video and then we'll come back to the series. So in that case study with Tara, it's really clear the power dynamics that can sometimes exist between a worker and a person with disability. And it is within most people's lived experience and lived memory that we were institutionalizing and using restrictive practices. And still to this day, restrictive practices exist for people with disabilities. So it's really important to acknowledge that, particularly as being another worker that's coming into a person with disabilities' life, and how that power dynamic can play out and potentially put some barriers into working well together. It's also something that I would say that in the case of Tara, a lot of workers often don't have much training or support when they hear disclosures of sexual assault or domestic and family violence. And in our previous workshop, we mentioned the training series that WorkUp and the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research developed. So I'd really encourage you to go back to workshop 3 and utilise that resource to share with support workers that you're working alongside. As you can see too, Tara couldn't articulate how she was feeling in a clear emotional words, such as she was nervous or scared, but she could describe the physical sensations. So there's definitely some clear first steps for working with Tara, but particularly I think her living with the perpetrator of violence would be of immediate concern. So in this case of Tara or anyone we're working with, particularly someone that already is accessing disability support, it's really important as workers we have a bit of a base understanding of how that sector functions and where and how we can get additional support or emergency support for the people we're working alongside. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme is originated in about 5 years ago, and implementation is pretty much finished across the country, and it has shifted our disability support service sector to have an individual focus. And if I was a person with disability, I could directly access support services via the agency directly. However, now the shift is that for a person to access this support, they now will be assessed by the NDIS and then provided a package that's usually an annual 12 months that stipulates how much funding they can access for the services that they need. And the individual is meant to have choice and control in what they choose to do with that funding. So in August 2020, there was about 400,000 or plus participants in the scheme. However, there's 4.4 million people in Australia that identify as having a disability. So that's less than 10% of the disability population that access the NDIS. And Erica, that co-delivered this workshop originally and helped co-design this workshop, so she'll discuss further how she's found innovative supports. And I encourage you to have a look at the handout now, which will have a link to the NDIS website, so you can learn more about the process of accessing this support for people you're working with. So like I mentioned, not all support is through the NDIS. So in Queensland right now, if you are ineligible for the NDIS, so you've applied and you've been rejected, you can then access the Queensland Community Support Scheme. So this is a little pool of funding that sort of functions as the previous disability sector funding worked, in that if you have evidence that you've been rejected from the NDIS, you can contact the Queensland Community Support Scheme, and they can then offer you a limited amount of support through a disability service for things such as social support, domestic support such as cleaning, and usually that incurs a co-payment, so anywhere from $5 to $15 per hour, and the rest is subsidised by the Queensland government. Talking to a lot of women in the focus group, they talked about other things that they utilise as disability support, such as online shopping, home delivery of groceries or meals, like frozen meals, that neighbours, friends and family, including a person's children, often provide a huge amount of support. Informal support groups, peer-managed social media groups. Erica, as well as a few other participants, are active members, and Erica, in fact, coordinates a social media peer group for people that live with MECFS, and has found that a really useful point of support. And then also tools and aids such as rubbish grabbers or tongs, so that it saves a person having to bend over, and other aids such as that. So there's lots of innovative supports that we can offer a person if they can't access a mainstream disability support. So unfortunately, as I've mentioned, not many people, the majority of people that have a disability cannot access the NDIS. And so service availability also doesn't necessarily mean service accessibility. So People with Disabilities Australia created the report Stop the Violence Project, which was a report around the proceedings and outcomes of the National Symposium on the Violence Against Women and Girls with Disabilities. So there's a link here about this report, and particularly it talks about the fact that we have a growing increase in services and support around sexual violence, domestic and family violence, women's health and well-being. But as those services become more available, they're not necessarily accessible to women and girls with disabilities. And so there are more barriers that are coming up for people trying to access support, though it's becoming more broadly available. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at this particular report, but also too in your handout, there's links to the Queensland Government's Domestic and Family Violence Support website that talks about all of the services available in Queensland. And you can also find some additional training on our WILD website that can talk more specifically about working better with women with intellectual disabilities. So we've talked a little bit about the barriers that exist and the services that exist externally to our sector. So I'd like to kind of focus on the fact that people with disabilities often have a lot of different services and people involved in their lives. And when you're working with someone, we know for a fact that for example, domestic violence service, we will not have disability-specific support services we can offer. So we need to work collaboratively or have an interagency approach. And using service mapping as an example here is a really useful tool as a worker to quickly and clearly identify who is currently present in a person's life. So you can see here there's a lot of different examples of services here, and not all of them will be present in a person with disabilities life. So some may have a decision maker. So that can be formal or informal, and that's always important to clarify. It could be a public guardian that is court appointed, or a decision maker that's also court appointed, or it might just be someone that's a carer or informal support person that often makes decisions for a person. With community and religious groups, whether or not a person has a carer, a support coordinator, and that's via the NDIS, so someone that's essentially functions as a case manager for a person's disability support services. A person might be involved with police or justice, so is there a DVO in place or any other court proceedings or court orders? Housing, the current arrangements, is this through public housing or a private arrangement? Family and friends, support workers, medical support such as a GP or hospital engagement, therapeutic supports, is there counselling or animal therapy, for example, and child safety or other systems. So is there any mandatory reporting that's required for you as a worker? I want you to take a moment now to pause and reflect and create a service map for yourself, considering all the services and support you access in your daily life. Often as workers, we have an expectation for the people we're working with to be really transparent with us and talk around all the different things that are happening in their lives. And this is a really necessary thing so we can work best with them and have a good understanding and a clear snapshot of who and what is happening within their lives. But sometimes it takes us a minute to remember how that can be an uncomfortable or difficult experience. So put yourself in the shoes of someone you might be working with, and I want you to create a service map for yourself. So do you have any medical support? What sort of social or informal supports do you have? And what services are involved in your life? What sort of housing do you have? So take a moment, pause the video and draw a service map for yourself, and then come back to the video and we'll continue onwards. So I hope you were able to draw yourself up a service map. Erica, who co-designed this workshop with me, generously let me share with you all her service map and the services that are currently involved in her life. As I mentioned earlier, she has a chronic health condition and disability that isn't able to access the NDIS. So she uses a lot of informal support services. So she uses Airtasker a lot for home modifications and cleaning. Social media, as I mentioned, she coordinates some peer support groups. Community and religious groups that she's involved with offer social support. She utilizes online shopping. She has a lot of medical support for chronic health condition, especially a really good GP. Erica also accesses support workers, particularly for transport, through the Queensland Community Support Scheme. So that is a co-payment for subsidised transport support. And she mentioned that friends were the biggest support in her life that help her with day-to-day living activities. So that can give you a bit of an idea. Not everyone has a very typical disability support service map. Another great resource we can utilise is a client-directed service plan. And this is a resource we use at Wild, and this is how we structure our client-directed service plans. So this is a really great resource when you first start working with someone. And in my personal experience as a caseworker, I found this a really good, clear way to set goals and tasks and keep yourself as a worker accountable to the person you're working with, and making sure that we both understand very clearly what the work we're doing together is and how we're going to go about it. Particularly when working with people with an intellectual disability, it's really important that we have a lot of clarity and a lot of really specific steps into how we're achieving each of the goals. And with a client's consent, this is also something we can share with support workers or case managers or carers in a person's life, so that they can help reinforce these steps. So for an example, just say that I've started working with a new client called Steph, and we're working within the context of Wild, so providing support after an experience of sexual assault. So in the first step, we would say, okay, we need to go to the GP for a sexual health check. And Steph and I have talked about it, and she doesn't have a regular GP. So you can see we've really broken down really explicitly how we're going to go about this process. So for example, Steph will talk to her friend about the sexual health check process and the best GP she should go to. And then Steph will let me know about who that GP is that her friend saw. So then I've agreed that I will make the appointment, and I will then text Steph the details of the appointment once I know. Steph then said she'll ask her support worker to get her Medicare card. For some people living in shared accommodation particularly, or who need a bit of support in keeping track of their important items such as their wallet, sometimes Medicare cards, IDs, bank cards are kept in a locked safe. In this case, Steph had to ask her worker to get her Medicare card for the appointment. I also said to Steph I'd text her the day before the appointment, and then I said I would pick Steph up and together we'd go to the GP. And then I've got a sort of end date or a goal date. I will book the appointment and it will be on Thursday, Friday the 3rd of December. So you can see how then that way there's a nice, clear, explicit, broken down way of perceiving what might just be something that we don't think too deeply about as a worker, as just one of the many things we do when working with someone. But then also having this on someone's file means that if I'm not available, another worker can bring this up and can reassure Steph of what's going to happen when we're working together. And it also means that with Steph's direction, we can choose what the priority is, because often there's a myriad of different things we need to do when we start working with someone. So really allowing this discussion to then also prioritize what goals need to happen first before the next. So feel free to utilize this when you're working with people. And of course, it will always be changing and evolving as different things come up in a person's life. So now we're going to talk about some external supports and resources that we as workers can utilize when working with someone with a disability. And one of these is the Sunny app. This was developed by 1-800-RESPECT and was co-designed by women with disabilities. So this is a easy to understand application that helps women to tell their story, understand what has happened, know their rights, find people who can help, understand what abuse is, and learn about different types of abuse. So you can see here it has a safety function where a person can hide and it looks just like the lock screen of a phone. But essentially this is developed to support particularly women with an intellectual disability, so it's really easy to understand. It uses emojis and clear symbols to represent how to understand abuse and a person's rights. And particularly it helps someone construct how to tell their story after they've experienced particularly sexual violence. So a really good app to use and keep on your work phone as a worker. When we're working with someone that's experiencing crisis, it's often common that someone's needing additional support around essential items and financial support. So these are a few different places in Queensland that we can look to seek that support. So if someone's experienced a violent crime such as domestic and family violence or sexual violence, we can look to Victim Assist Queensland. VAQ, as commonly known, can also offer support with referrals to support services. So definitely a great place to utilise, and often can direct you as a worker as to what other supports are available. And you can also request support directly from Victim Assist to work with the person you're working with, the client, to make their application for VAQ funds. And that's often to replace items that have been damaged and to pay for therapeutic support such as counselling or psychology, as well as other things. Emergency food relief is often extremely necessary and useful, and I would really recommend you look at your local neighbourhood centres or church and community groups. And if you ever look at the handout for this workshop, there's a directory that you can look to find out what's local to you and the person you're working with to get emergency food relief. Services Australia also have crisis payments, so you can look there as well for a little financial support for a person. Some major banks actually offer financial support, particularly around domestic and family violence. So sometimes depending whether or not the person you're working with is with one of the major banks usually. Rise Up and Friends with Dignity are particularly charitable organisations that offer goods as well as sometimes financial support to people, particularly women who've experienced sexual violence or domestic and family violence. But definitely go and have a look on the handout where we'll break down a lot more of those resources you can access. A really, really useful resource is Easy Read resources. And we've spoken about these across the last couple of workshops. And at Wild in particular, we utilize these a lot when working with people with intellectual disabilities. I've mentioned previously that Wild has developed 2 booklets that you can see here, the You Deserve to Be Safe booklets, that are free to download off our website, or you can contact Wild to be sent a series of printed versions of these handouts. Utilizing the bear cards or emoji cards or anything similar like that is really great to have a conversation about someone, particularly when you're assessing risk or safety planning and wanting to understand best how a person might be feeling in their current circumstances. But if the words are hard to find, and often this is useful even for someone who's just experienced trauma, as it's hard to sometimes articulate how we're feeling. So by utilizing these cards that sort of provide a visual, non-verbal way of describing how you're feeling, they're super useful. I'd also say if these resources aren't available to you in the moment, even just drawing or utilizing a whiteboard to create a visual image of how someone might be feeling or just describing their experience can sometimes be a really nice, easy read way to communicate clearly with someone you're working with that has a disability. So aside from utilizing resources, it's also clear that sometimes when we're working with someone, we will need to refer them on, or we'll need to refer them to another support service to provide support in an area that we can't as a worker. And when we're discussing these referral options, it's really important that we keep the person we're working with informed, particularly about why we're referring them on, and also about what strengths that referral will provide them, such as better specialized support, a quicker access to support services, for example. And always discuss the referral first with the person and double check that this is something that they want. And when we're discussing these referral options, it's really important that we respect a person's identity and their unique needs. So that is, of course, the level of risk, any of the barriers that may exist, particularly, for example, working at Wild, though we're a specialized service for people with intellectual disabilities, we are also very resource limited. And if someone is experiencing crisis, we'll often want to refer them to a more mainstream service that can provide that crisis immediate support. But in saying that, we of course need to identify where that isn't a specialized disability service. And though they'll be able to access support, it might mean that the style of working is a little different to how we work at Wild, and really making that clear. And where possible, it might be taking a collaborative approach. We need to, of course, identify a person's concerns about that place, the levels of trauma and risk that are currently at play, and of course, a person's priorities, what they want to do first, not what we as a worker want them to do, and their culture and their family. It's important to acknowledge too that disability has a culture in and of itself, and that we want to make sure that a person feels that at the core of all of it, they have choice and control in what happens for them. A great way to approach these style of conversations around referrals or just generally around support is often a conversational support. So that means that we are acknowledging that this is a back and forth conversation and that I as the worker don't hold all the power within this. So it acknowledges and respects a person's identity and needs. It promotes a person's agency and choice. So what information they want shared with the new agency, always respecting their views about other organizations. So potentially they've had a negative or positive experience with an organization previously, so that'll impact whether or not they want to work with them. Where appropriate, filling out referral forms together. I found that a really great way to create a warm referral or a warm handover is as much as possible supporting that process in accessing the new service and being really transparent. Often we have to share a lot of relevant information that's very personal information, so making sure that we're sharing that and being clear about what we're sharing, and especially about when we're sharing information about a person's children or their other dependents, and ensure that consent is provided at all points of this conversation. It's really important that we are preventing and minimizing harm and acknowledging that that person or the client has done that themselves. Because sometimes when we're referring someone to a crisis or high risk team, for example, referral, sometimes it can feel like we are diminishing the great efforts a person has gone to minimize the risk for them and their families. So always making sure we're validating that and not judging that. Also, always recognizing the unique access barriers. So we understand there's a lot of discrimination that exists for people with disabilities, the physical barriers, including transport. Maybe that's something that you, in the warm referral process, can help map out the transport maps for that person, particularly when they're using public transport. There's going to be language barriers, helping them access a translator. And lack of trust in particular services often comes up for people with disabilities. And leaving the door open to your services. This is a really huge one, and it doesn't take much. It can just be that, okay, that this is the end of our work. I've helped you access this service. Even if it's possible, following up about how that first appointment went. But most of all, welcoming them to re-access your service. And if it's that you can't provide them support, it's that they can contact you again to then get another warm referral to another organization. So always keeping the door open so no one feels that they're being pushed out or isolated in this experience. Sometimes in our sector, and unfortunately, particularly in current pandemic circumstances, a lot of our therapeutic supports, such as psychologists and counsellors, are at their capacity, and long wait periods often occur when seeking therapeutic support. So things like group work and education programs can be a great alternative or additional support to survivors to share and gain strength and understanding through sharing both their experience and hearing other people's experiences through education. There's a few of those group programs that exist throughout Queensland, and I'd really recommend that you contact your local either sexual assault or domestic and family violence service to see what programs they have. But through WILD in particular, we do offer disability-focused group programs. So we have the Domestic and Family Violence Group that we offer by demand in Logan, Caboolture and Brisbane. And we also have the You and Me Relationships Group and the Women's Groups. The Women's Group only exists in our WILD office, but we do have the You and Me Relationships Group, which is designed for people with intellectual disabilities to better understand relationships. And that is something that WILD can actually train your staff to then deliver. And that can happen anywhere within Queensland or broader. So please get in contact with WILD if that's something you're interested in upskilling in, but definitely have a look at the handout at the different groups that might be available in your area. There are a heap of other resources and services that you can access that some of the women that part of our focus groups endorsed. We've got Home Assist Secure, so that's for home maintenance and repairs for people with disability. The Patient Travel Subsidy Scheme if someone's accessing medical support. There's STAR-H, which is Wesley Mission's free case management and planning support for people that are at risk of homelessness. Q-Stars, so the tenant advice and referral service. Also, sometimes pets are often a huge factor when trying to find safe place for someone to go. So pet sitters via Porshake or Pet Cloud, and Get Ready and Plan Ahead, which is a person-centered emergency preparedness program by Queenslanders with Disability Network. Sometimes too, because there is so limited resourcing, it's about being innovative in how someone can seek support potentially for a different issue such as housing that can then support their current circumstances around, for example, domestic and family violence. So once again, these are all in your handout to have a look at further. People with disabilities often have advocates or decision makers in their lives, and they function sometimes in a similar space, but are very different support services. So advocacy can either be a general support service or it can be an individual support service. So an advocate can be someone that's requesting policy change or major change, structural change, or it can be for an individual. And often advocates are a great way to access additional support when a person is experiencing discrimination or a lack of support, often within a disability service managed supported accommodation or other circumstances like this. And there's a lot of advocates around that you can access to support you as a worker when working with someone. This helps someone speak up for their rights Also can be a support person to go to meetings and can speak on behalf of someone and can help lodging complaints. So there's People with Disabilities Australia, the First People's Disability Network Australia, Emparo, Advocacy Services Queensland. Also not listed here is Speaking Up for You, and a few other services exist, particularly when you want a change in someone's NDIS or disability supports after they've experienced domestic and family violence or sexual violence. Advocates can often understand the industry and the system a lot better than us working in our own sectors. So definitely utilize those that have that specialized disability understanding. And then decision makers are then someone that speak often on a person's behalf and usually are formally appointed by QCAT, so the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or the court. So this is when someone has been deemed to have impaired decision-making capacity, or they are a child or a young person in child protection, or also people living in facilities such as detention, mental health units, or disability services. In Queensland, we have the public guardian for decision-making, or the public trustee that operates as supported decision-making and management of finances. It's really important to understand if someone has one of these present. Also, a decision maker can be someone in someone's family or their carer that's also been appointed by QCAT. But sometimes there's some confusion around things such as power of attorney, and that in fact doesn't have as much significance in a person's life than that of a public guardian. And really helping someone to understand at the key, you want the client or the person to be making as much decisions for themselves as possible. But as a worker, you often will have to work collaboratively with their decision maker where appropriate. So here's a case study as we come to the end of today's workshop. So as we have before, I'm going to read it aloud, and then I encourage you to pause, have a reflection, a discussion with your colleagues, and then we'll continue. You've been working in a DV service with Jade as her case manager for 12 months. Jade calls you and tells you she needs to move. You explore why, and Jade says that she has started receiving mail from her ex-partner or the perpetrator of violence. Jade says that she also saw him in her driveway a few days ago, and Jade has a current DVO against him. Jade has 2 children, aged 10 and 8, that she has part-time care of. However, the perpetrator of violence is not the father. Jade uses walking sticks some days and has custom ramps, handrails, and a chairlift installed in her home. Your service also supports Jade with ongoing counselling. Jade really wants to move as she does not feel safe. Jade's home is managed by the Department of Housing. So thinking about what are the first things you want to explore with Jade, what are your ideas for support for Jade, and are there any other services you might want to engage or collaborate with to support Jade? So pause the video and then come back to the training workshop. In Jade's circumstances, we can identify that for many people in Queensland who live within public housing, it is very difficult to access public housing, and once within a public housing managed home, it can be really difficult to get a transfer, particularly when living in the city or a metropolitan area. And with Jade requiring all these home modifications, it also means that there might not be a suitable alternative living arrangement for Jade. So sometimes it can be really difficult as a worker because we could identify that moving probably would be a great first step in safety for Jade. However, it might just not be something that's possible immediately. So with the current DVO, as well as additional supports around Jade, it might be helping her to understand how to breach the perpetrator of violence, and it also might be trying to support her to understand where this mail is coming from and how it can be redirected, or having her address not listed with certain services anymore. These can be really complicated, and often it means working collaboratively with Department of Housing or run any other disability-specific services in Jade's life so that she can be safe and also have her support needs met. Also making sure her children are safe, and because they are young, it may mean that you do have to make a report to child safety if you do feel their safety is being compromised at the moment. But always discussing this with Jade first. So we have a couple of quotes here from Women with Disability, and I would encourage you to pause the video and have a read of these, but I'll just quickly pull one out just to share with you all. These are all coming from our focus groups. Don't think because he, the perpetrator of violence, has a disability that he won't be as dangerous. I felt like my support workers didn't think he was a worry because he was in a wheelchair. They were really wrong. Often as workers, we can diminish the capacity of a person with disability who's seeking support, but that also means we can diminish the risk and level of risk of someone that is perpetrator of violence that also has a disability. And it's really important we always listen to the person we're working with and always consider and prioritize their perspective of their safety as being what we take as the truth. So have another read of those. And now I'm very excited to introduce Erica that will be having a discussion with us. Erica helped co-design this particular workshop and also participate in our focus groups. And as a woman living with disability, particularly with a chronic health condition, she has some really unique insights, as well as accessing mainstream support services for domestic and family violence and sexual violence support in the past, and giving her insight around those. So please enjoy this in conversation with myself and Erica. Welcome back, Erica.
Good morning.
So today's focus is on resources and support for workers supporting women with disabilities, including chronic health conditions. And first, I wanted to sort of highlight some of the things that we spoke about at the last conversation we had in workshop 2. Energy impairment and disability inclusion is often overlooked by workers. Why do you think, Erica, is it so important for workers to understand the impacts of fatigue for people with disabilities, including chronic health conditions?
Well, first of all, according to the UK research across that included at least 50 energy limiting chronic health conditions, such as endometriosis, AIDS, backache, and so forth, fatigue was the most debilitating symptom. I think it is so important. The second thing, in terms of the face-to-face interaction with the domestic and family violence worker, is that because the fatigue is so deep and widespread, it can really create huge barriers for the woman trying to reach out for help. And what I mean by fatigue, it's not like you just run a marathon, you feel really tired, or you've had a long day at work, you feel really tired. If anyone has had hepatitis, it's like that, but worse. Or if you just had, major surgery and it's right after you've had that surgery, it's that level of fatigue. And remember, I couldn't whisper for more than 20 seconds. I couldn't sit up, even though before this illness, I was very athletic. So what this means in terms of interaction with the domestic and family violence services, it can, in a logistical sense, it can mean it's so much harder for the woman to reach out. So if your service is able to try and tackle all the issues in one visit, that would be ideal. In other words, to minimize multiple trips. Obviously, it would mean things like if you have a place that we can lie down, that would be fantastic. Even on the phone, if you can speak slowly, that's less straining. So there's all those sorts of workarounds.
Totally. And even some of the recommendations then, other women with disabilities I've spoken to for this series have said that they prefer shorter sessions with their workers that have like a focus each time. So, and I think so it really sounds like really very early, very quickly ascertaining what those goals are or what those support needs are that a woman is requesting from you as a worker, and talking with the person individually. How is this going to work best for you? Is it we try and get as much done as we can when you're feeling good? Or is it that we spread this out? Is it that we try and arrange so that we're in one of our counseling rooms that has a lounge so you can be lying down while we have these conversations, or we can do it over teleconference? It sounds like flexibility is really one of the key things we need to consider.
I agree. And I think because it's kind of like that interlinkage between the trauma and the fatigue, they're both worsening each other. So,
Mm,
yeah,
mm.
you can
Uh,
tackle both of those at the same time.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah. Because I was going to ask what are some key things to keep in mind when supporting someone with fatigue, but it really just sounds like really listening to the person, but taking that moment to empathize, considering when the worker themselves has been in a state of illness or recovery from major surgery, or when they've had an incredibly exhausting few days and need to be in bed all day just to recover. It's just like keeping that in mind, that that could be someone's almost everyday experience, and accommodating that. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's best to keep that in mind, but might not be a good idea to say, oh, yes, I've had surgery and I know what fatigue can be like. That
Mm,
might backfire
mm,
because the woman might think, yeah, but you don't understand my level of fatigue, or you're trying to one up me, trying to outdo me.
mm,
Maybe just say, oh, that must be, just empathize, oh, that must be really, really debilitating.
absolutely. And I think that a lot of the time it's just not useful to share that use of self, because it often means that you're positioning yourself to understand something that you really don't, but using that as sort of an internal point of reflection as a worker, just to empathize a bit better.
Yeah, to say, I can imagine just how debilitating that must be for you.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
I mean, to give an example, I know when I called one of the domestic violence services, I could tell that the call center worker was trying to relate when I said, I've got someone with severe chronic fatigue syndrome. And she was trying to relate that she understood. She says, oh, yes, I appreciate, is that caused by vitamin D deficiency, isn't it? And I said, well, not necessarily. And I tried to
mm,
reassure her, look, I don't expect you to understand all the depths of it because only half the medical profession does anyway, but
mm,
just take it at face value. It's, yeah,
mm,
extreme debilitating fatigue that she can't even get out of bed.
mm.
So it's hard. It's hard to not try and jump in and try and relate using other examples, but sometimes that can backfire. So I think just saying, yes, that's must be really debilitating for you. And I can imagine how hard that must be.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good point of advice for workers. Um, because and I guess in this workshop we are talking about resources and support that workers should be aware of to support women with disabilities, including chronic health conditions, who are experiencing gendered violence.
But again, my supports, similar to what I said in workshop two, a lot of it is my friends. I have very good doctors. The doctors are able to refer me to excellent specialists. I have friends that help me, but let me just make one caveat. When I know a lot of people, even myself, when we think about supports available for people with disability, there's sort of this assumption that, oh, but surely you can find a friend or relative or a neighbor that'll help you out, that can drive you here and there, or that can look up things for you. Good doctors. I mentioned Airtasker,
Yeah,
I mentioned the food banks,
yeah,
social media, definitely with Facebook, um, online shopping, and
yeah,
then day-to-day workarounds, like tools and aids. Um, in my community, people, they use sunglasses because they're light sensitive. They'll use earplugs because of the noise sensitivity. I definitely have that. We use plastic cutlery and dishes so that we don't drop and break things.
hmm,
Um, some people even bring their own pillow because a lot of chairs are too hard and therefore painful.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of, some people use those rubbish grabber tongs to reach down to
Oh
pick up
yeah.
things or pull up their socks.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in your experience, Erica, what would you say are some of, I guess, an example of when you've accessed support, particularly around domestic and family violence? Is there, I guess, a positive and a negative experience you can share with us, just to, I guess, give us a bit of an understanding?
More recently was when I contacted the Women's Legal Service here in Brisbane. I mentioned that I have this chronic fatigue syndrome, and is there a place somewhere quiet where I could sit? And they said yes, outside, and it was cool. Of course, before I even contacted them, I made sure by looking on Google Maps, how closely can I park? The staff were very respectful. They listened to me. They spoke slowly and quietly. Yeah, I think those were sort of the main aspects, because again, it was none of this, oh, you're sort of dismissing, because I know of peers that have even been dismissed or even laughed at by their own doctors, whereas the Women's Legal Service were very, very good.
Mm. And it's good to hear about Women's Legal Service being really accommodating to you. And I think that's a really great example to share with workers, to know it doesn't take, sounds like it doesn't take too much just to ask those couple of additional questions and make those accommodations so that someone feels like they feel safe and it's possible to access support.
I think one thing that would be really easy to institute and low cost is the hand soap in your bathrooms. Use fragrance-free ones
Mm.
on your website. I mean, given that 20% of the population has chemical sensitivity, and that is a common one.
A big thing we talk about in accessibility of services is that as a person accessing a service, I should know that I should just feel assured that there's going to be a place for me where I'm not going to have to feel like I have to request a heap of accommodations to be made. I should just know that I know I can go to the bathroom and there's that other waiting room or that other counseling room that's going to be fragrance free. So I can organize not to have to spend any time in the waiting room. I can go straight there without having to make a lot of requests for that to be possible, because that can put a lot of labor on the person trying to get support when they have to also request additional support.
Yes, and if the Domestic and Family Violence Center can make it clear up front, or even in the phone call, they said, well, if you're coming to visit our office, here are some things that we could provide as adjustments. Would these be useful to you? Because I know a lot of people with disability are tired of constantly having to ask again and again for things. It's challenging to accommodate everything, but even if you can indicate a few examples, that shows a willingness at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just making those things broadly known so a person can just pop on your website and feel assured that they're going to have their supports needs met, I think, instead of having to inquire if that's a possibility. I think that would be a really good recommendation. Are there any final thoughts that you want to share with us before we wrap this up?
I think since the various disabilities and chronic health conditions are so diverse and can be so complex, I mean, if you're having to assist the woman in chasing up evidence, maybe a good place to start to try and understand what that disability entails is maybe contact places like Queenslanders with Disability Network, so that they can then refer you to whatever the specific patient organization may be. I think that's a good starting point.
Absolutely. And just to clarify, what's the what's the name of your support group?
Well,
So people can access it for people they might know.
it's the Brisbane MECFS support group, and it's on Facebook.
Great.
But I think nationally, I mean, there are several. You could possibly contact what's known as in Facebook MECFS Australia community.
Mm-hmm.
And then the peak organization is MECFS Australia Limited.
Fantastic. And I'll include a link to those sites and spaces in our handouts for this workshop.
Yeah, I think since long COVID is a thing, and there's a lot of crossover with our community that might be of assistance.
Yeah.
But again, I think to start with, and if the worker's unsure about what a particular disability entails, I'd say link in with whatever the patient support group is. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your contributions and this discussion, Erica. I think it's been so valuable, and I know the workers watching this training will agree with me. I'll make sure to have all the links in the handout to those support groups if you are working with someone that might be able to access that support. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time, Erica.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening and watching this workshop around resources and support. I hope it's been informative. Please make sure you have a look at the handout. There's a heap of extra information there. And feel free to have a look at the WILD, WorkUp and QDM websites where you can get a heap more information. The next workshop will be our 5th and final workshop in this series that discusses inclusion of women with disabilities as both clients and staff. So I look forward to working with you all then. Thank you for watching.